More Americans lose their virginity on prom night than any other night in their lives. That is a fact. And while I may not be American, I was counting heavily on the power of statistics when I graduated from high school in June of 1995.
This is Common Ties, and comedian Ryan Murphy's story took place in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He talked about and recorded his story from his home in Vancouver, BC.
My prom date was Rebecca Grossman, a girl I had known for 3 years and had developed a crush on in the past 3 weeks. We shared a passion for drama, alternative music, and as I would discover only years later, women. Rebecca wasn't exactly a man-hating lesbian, but she did have a deeper appreciation for Melissa Etheridge than most women in our graduating class. It's just as well that I didn't know about Rebecca's sexual identity, since most of what I did know about lesbians was limited to what I had learned from watching porn films. I knew they were gorgeous, I knew they were sexually wanton, and I knew that they lived in sororities and occasionally got sent to all women's prisons. In other words, I knew nothing. Rebecca and I went to the prom with my best friend Spencer Murray and his date Jennifer Simpson. Spencer and I had both lusted after Jennifer over the years, but had always been rebuked. Spencer had asked Jennifer out 3 times that year and been flatly denied on each occasion. The fact that she agreed to go to the prom with him seemed like something of a miracle, and it was an opportunity that Spencer wasn't about to waste. Unfortunately, it wasn't completely up to him. Jennifer began the evening of our prom by announcing that she had a terrible headache. She apologized profusely, too much upon reflection, and kept to herself for most of the meal. When the dancing began, she politely stayed off to the side, disappearing almost entirely for most of the night. Following the dance, we all went to a beach a half-hour away. Spencer and I piled into a car belonging to our friend Darren, while Jennifer and Rebecca piled into a second vehicle. We agreed to meet each other in a half hour after we had time to change and freshen up. Spencer was upset that dinner hadn't been smoother, but was still optimistic. Ever the gentleman, but mostly just desperate to get laid. He even brought along some aspirin to ease Jennifer's headache. I was also upbeat. Rebecca hadn't responded much to my advances at dinner, and she had spent most of the evening slow dancing with a woman with a crew cut, but I was reasonably certain that she was just playing hard to get. Definitely desperate to get laid, I brought along 12 condoms. Clearly, I understood as little about sex as I did about lesbians. Regardless of what we did or didn't know, we felt confident that a moonlit beach would be the ultimate aphrodisiac. Roaring bonfires had been lit across the beach, and people were passing joints and passing out in equal numbers. We walked amongst them, looking around for our dates for nearly half an hour. We found hordes of drunken teens, and several of our classmates having sex in the bushes, but we didn't find our dates. Needing desperately to warm ourselves up, Spencer and I decided to return to Darren's car. The moment we got within 50 feet of Darren's Lincoln Town car, we noticed it was bouncing up and down. We had all agreed in the drive down that if the car's a rockin', don't come a knockin'. But we had never said a thing about not peeking. Spencer and I approached the back passenger side window and looked in. What we saw wasn't Darren, but the lily-white ass of Anthony Gates pumping away. Beneath him was Jennifer Simpson. Her eyes were sealed shut, and she was moaning heavily. Spencer was devastated. What really hurt wasn't that Anthony and Spencer were bitter rivals. It was that Anthony hadn't even worn a tux to the prom. He had gone in his father's rumpled suit. In our opinion, guys like that didn't deserve to get laid. Spencer backed away, completely dejected. I tried to console him, but he was beyond words. So instead, I consoled myself by staring into the car for a while longer. Frustrated, but also still cold, Spencer opened up Darren's trunk, fished out a couple of beers, and then crawled in, warming himself up as best as he could. Feeling foolish standing alone, I joined Spencer and lay down beside him, as Anthony and Jennifer made the car bounce and sway like a perverted merry-go-round. We both just lay there, bouncing up and down. It was at that point that Darren, bounding into the beach parking lot, saw us. He gave us a big wave and began jogging towards us, then running, then sprinting. Still 5 feet away, Darren dove headfirst into the trunk. The force of Darren's impact and his wildly flailing legs caused the trunk to slam shut. For a moment, everything was perfectly quiet. We couldn't hear the waves breaking on the shore. The wind was barely whistling, and the moaning had ceased in the back seat. That is when the yelling began. Spencer started to savagely rip into Darren, unleashing all of his pent-up frustration. After 5 minutes, the back doors of the car opened, and Anthony and Jennifer walked away. We screamed for help, but they didn't respond to any of our entreaties. And so, we waited. Seconds turned into minutes, and minutes turned into hours. We passed the time alternating between berating Darren and consoling Spencer. When we got tired of that, we screamed for help. By now, we had been in Darren's trunk for an excruciating 3 hours. Darren kept on reminding us of how much warmer it was in the trunk than on the beach, but that was hardly any consolation. Last time someone spent that much time in a trunk, they ended up face down in the Hudson River. We finally got rescued just after the 3-hour and 20-minute mark. Our savior was Jim Jim, a 23-year-old who had just wrapped up his 8th, but certainly not final year of high school football. Jim Jim had evidently heard our girlish cries and popped open the trunk to investigate. What he found were Spencer and I staring back up at him, and Darren flat on his chest, with his ass perched high in the air. Jim Jim didn't bother asking any questions. Well, he knew better than that. Instead, he took Darren by the ankles and ripped him out of the trunk, nearly robbing him of his manhood in the process. Spencer and I crawled out, shook Jim Jim's hand, and then took turns beating Darren. It was now 7 a.m. Not only had we not lost our virginity, but I had spent the better part of my prom night with my face wedged in another man's armpit. For years after, I wondered what had ever become of Rebecca Grossman. It wasn't until 6 years later, in the fall of 2001, that I saw her again. Rebecca was doing her master's at Concordia University and was living 2 houses down the street from my own apartment. It was pure serendipity. I also discovered that she had completely abandoned any interest in lesbianism. We went out for coffee, rehashed old times, and discussed mutual friends. Before long, one thing led to another, and we ended up in her apartment, making out on her couch. Rebecca and I remained friends, but we never kissed again. We didn't have to. The circle had already been completed. It may have taken me longer than most to have closed the chapter in high school, but I did it on my own terms. I sealed it with a kiss. Was high school the best time of my life? No. But at least now, more than 10 years later, I can say that it's finally over. If only Jim Jim were so lucky.
You've been listening to Common Ties. I'm the editor, Elizabeth Moore, and this story was produced by Walter Dixon.